Hello, my name is Dan Rothman from the West Union, Iowa Assembly. I'm going to give my testimony. I'd like to make it known, first of all, that I'm not a preacher. And one of the scariest things for me is speaking in front of a crowd. And I've noticed that the older I get, the more emotional I get. So hopefully I don't start crying in front of everybody, because it's embarrassing enough with people I know, but here's people I don't know. I was raised in the Lutheran denomination, and that's where my background comes from. I'm the second oldest kid in my family. There was 5 of us. My mother, she had trouble when she was pregnant with me. She was instructed to lay on her back and don't get up for all the time for 3 months. And they thought they were going to lose me. I was born premature, 4 or 5 weeks premature. Back in the 50s, they sent you home, and if you lived, you lived. You died, you died. After a few weeks, they didn't think I was going to make it, and so they called in the Lutheran minister. He came out to our farm, and he baptized me. And I was told that when I was older, of course. You don't remember nothing when you're 2 weeks old. But if you look at my baby book, there's a little line in there. It says, the 6 weeks he developed a terrible temper. And my uncle used to tell everybody that I was the most stubborn kid he's ever seen in his life. Anyway, so I was that troublemaker. Everything always seemed funny to me. I was always getting into trouble. My mother, she taught school, and so I couldn't do anything wrong, it seemed like, because everybody always knew what I was doing wrong. But I had to go to confirmation when I was like 13 or 14, and I didn't like confirmation. I didn't really care for anything they were talking about. They were talking mainly about the 10 Commandments, what they meant, and how you could do, and that you needed to follow the 10 Commandments. And then they talked about the Martin Luther and how he broke away from the Catholic Church and how he started the Lutheran denomination. And so half the time I would get dropped off at the church for confirmation, and I'd go in one door and I'd sneak out the other door, and I'd go down the hill to a place called the Grill, and I would play a pinball machine, and then I would come back, and I'd go back to church just in time to get picked up by my folks and go back home. So I didn't really learn much in confirmation. And we were brought before the church after we were confirmed, and we had to take the bread and the wine. And I was sitting up there, we're on our knees, and they give us a little wafer, and they said, this is the Lord's Supper, this is bread, and then give us a little swallow of wine. And me and a friend of mine, we were joking. It's like, yeah, we're going to get you drunk on this wine. And we were cutting it up, and then he says, we should have put "Hi Mom" on our shoes, so when got on their knees, they would see that. Anyway, so there was a party for me for confirmation, and everybody was happy for me, but I didn't feel any different. And but I got a Bible for confirmation, and I always read a lot, and so I made a determination that I was going to read the Bible. And so after that evening, I went to go to bed, and I opened up the Bible, and I read Genesis chapter 1. And I didn't understand anything I was reading. I thought, well, I read Genesis chapter 1. So the next night, I thought, well, I got to read again. So I thought, well, I'll read Genesis chapter 1 again. And then chapter 2. So I read Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. And I thought, I don't understand what I'm reading. I thought, well, I've never started a book where I didn't finish it. So I thought, I'm going to read this Bible if it kills me. So the next night, I read Genesis chapter 1. I read Genesis chapter 2. I read Genesis chapter 3. And I thought, well, I guess I'll read this Bible later. Anyway, so, but I thought, I got to start going to church, because my dad never went to church except for maybe on Christmas, and my mom would go sporadically. And so I determined that I was going to go to church every week. I'm a member of this church now. And what really struck me, I'm not talking about this, I'm looking backwards, because at the time I didn't understand that the Lord was speaking to me. But after we took the bread and wine, the minister said the congregation, he'd like to welcome the newest members of the Universal Church of God. And I thought, well, what are you talking about? And so I didn't understand what that meant. So I thought, well, I better start going to church. Well, I was 15 years old and I had a paper route. And so every Sunday I'd get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and I had a 5-mile paper route and delivered 100 papers. And then I'd go home, get ready, and I'd go to church at 8 o'clock. And so I went to church every week for over a year. And but it just seemed like it did the same thing. He repeated these things, and I didn't understand anything. And they never preached the gospel. Of course, I didn't even know what the gospel was at that time. But I thought, well, this is what you're supposed to do. And after church one morning, I didn't know it, but the Lord was speaking to me. And I was down, coming up from the basement of the church, and I run into the minister. And these words come out of my mouth to the minister. He says, what do I got to do to get to heaven? And he looks at me and he puts his hand on my shoulder and he says, you're doing fantastic. He says, you've been baptized. You've been confirmed. You're coming to church every week. What more could God expect? And deep down I thought, this isn't right. And that's it. I never went back to church again. Well, the problem with that was, turned 16 years old. What happens in a rural community in Iowa? Well, we went out drinking. So a bunch of friends got together. My friend, he bought a car. And so we thought, well, we gotta get drunk. And so we were driving around drinking beer, and then somebody bought a pack of cigarettes, and they said, so thought we were pretty cool, smoking cigarettes and drinking beer. I got the next morning, I couldn't even hardly swallow. My throat was all, from the cigarettes, was all terrible, you know. And the good thing about it was I never smoked again. The bad thing was I continued to drink. It was a weekly thing. We would go out, and that's what we did. But before we had a car, we used to go to the Lutheran church on Saturday night because they had things for kids. And you could play ping pong or games or whatever, you know. They had a little snack and something to eat and some pop to drink, you know. And so we went there. It was called Paul's Place. Well, now we're out drinking, and there was like 6 of us. We're driving around this car, and somebody said, we should go to Paul's Place. So we pulled up in front of the Lutheran church, and well, now we're discussing, and I guess it's more like arguing about whether we should go on the Paul's Place. And I said, well, let's just go in. And I said, we're fun. And a friend of mine, and he was pretty religious. He still went to church every week. He says, we're drunk. We shouldn't be going into church like that. All of a sudden, boom, the door opens, and the minister says, what are you boys doing? And one of my friends, and we're all shocked. Nobody said nothing. And then he said, you guys been out drinking? And one of my friends goes, no, I'm a teetotaler. I just burst out laughing. I thought, teetotaler, we've been driving around getting drunk every weekend for who knows how long. And he said, you boys get out of here, you go home. You can't be coming into the church drunk. Anyway, but that really made me guilty. And I thought, what's the matter with me, you know? Anyway, but that's what I did. Kept on going out every weekend. And well, I guess we quit when football season was on because, our practices were pretty tough, and you didn't dare drink if you were playing football because it was bad. Anyway, so I graduated then. And my mom was a teacher, and she kept hassling me. She said, you need to go to college. And I said, I don't want to go to college. And she says, I want to take a year off. And one day she cornered me and brought me up to the guidance counselor. And the guidance counselor was laying at me. He said, you got to go to college. What college do you want to go to? And I kept saying, I don't want to go to college. I'm not ready. I was only 17. I was graduated at 17. And they finally said, well, just pick something. So I reached back behind me, and there was a whole rack of different pamphlets about different places to go to college and different things to do. And I just grabbed one. I said, okay, I'll do this. And he picks it up and says, oh, you want to be a computer programmer, huh? computer programmer. I don't know what computer programming is. I said, oh, whatever. Anyway, so now I moved to Cedar Rapids, Iowa. You might have heard of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, because it's the second biggest town in Iowa. But before that, I went to work for a local, it was called the turkey plant. They butchered turkeys and froze them and boxed them up and sent them out to be sold. And the first day I was there, I was put in the boxing department, and I was brought down the line, and I was working with this young blonde-haired girl with blue eyes, and Bonnie introduces me. She says, here's Diana Crane. And I said, hi, and I looked at her, and I said to myself, I'm going to marry that woman. And I don't know where it come from, but that's what I said. Anyway, so all that summer, I fell in love with Diana Crane. And got to the end of the summer, and it's time for me to start college, and she says, she was born and raised going to the gospel hall. She wasn't saved. She rebelled against the gospel. She had a 6-month-old son when I met her, and she had on and off again relationship with the father, and she says, you need to go to college. You're way too young to get involved with, especially a single mother. And so she broke up with me, and I went to college, and I kind of fell off the deep end. I drank on weekends, but now I started drinking every night. I got into smoking pot. The good thing was that there was 5 of us that rented this house, and one of the guys, he was on heroin. And I sat there one night, and he shot up with heroin. And I didn't care about anything, because I was in love, and she broke my heart. And he shot up with heroin, and I thought I should do that. I says, why do you do that? He says, it takes care of the pain. But I was afraid of needles, so Lord saved me from that. But I was doing terrible at school. I hated computer programming, and I thought, who can be a computer programmer? Sit there all logical thinking, ones and zeros, and I thought, oh, this is terrible. But I was working full time, and I was going to school full time. And the guy I worked for took me off to the side, and he says, you're in bad shape. And I says, I know. I says, I just don't care. He says, well, I said, I hate it. And I says, I just picked it out just to make my mom happy. But he says, well, how about running computers? And I says, I don't know nothing about it. He says, well, we can roll you in computer operations. And so I did, and I learned how to run mainframe computers. And so I got a degree doing that. And I decided that I wanted to live anywhere but Cedar Rapids because I had a lot of bad memories there. And so I got a job in Dubuque, Iowa, right on the border of Illinois and Wisconsin. And so I moved there. And every weekend I would go home, and I would work at the turkey plant just because I knew Diana was working there. And I wanted to see her. Anyway, I still love her, but this went on, and then I did that for a year, and I was barely able to make a living. And so I thought, well, I'm going to come home. And so I come home, and I told my dad, I says, my car is junk. I says, I can't hear. I says, everything's shot on it. So he says, well, let's go down and look at cars. And so I bought a car with no job, with no co-signing by my dad. And I come home, and my mom says, how are you going to pay for that? And I says, I'll get a job. So I called up my old boss. My senior year, I worked nights after school, and I worked at this place, and I says, I need a job. It's only going to be for a few weeks. I said, I'll find a permanent job somewhere else. Fine, so I come down there, and I started working there, and then I applied at a construction outfit, and I thought, I'll go work for Carlson Construction, and I'll do that. Well, I was working with this guy. What we did was we blew insulation in the houses. And he says, what are you working here for? I said, well, I'm waiting for Carlson's to call me. I says, I want to do the construction job. It pays good. And he said, why don't you get a job at Norplex? I said, what is Norplex? He says, I thought you were from Postville. He says, yeah. He says, that's the factory they built on the east side of town. And I thought, okay. So I got off work at 5 o'clock and I went down to this factory and I walked in the door and it was dark. And I started yelling and I said, hey, anybody here? Anybody here? And this great big dude comes out from the corner of the office and he starts yelling, what are you doing in here? And I said, I'm looking for a job. And he just, you got to realize I was young and I was cocky and I was mouthy. And he was asking me questions back and forth. And I thought, who's this guy think he is? And I was just mouthing out. Anyway, he offered me a job. He said, when can you start? I said, well, I just got done working 9 hours. I said, I'll go work right now if you want me to. He said, no, you just show up tomorrow at 4 o'clock. And so I showed up the next day at 4 o'clock, and I walked out on the floor, and the guy said, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm working here. So he put me in place to start working. Wasn't there 2 minutes, and somebody come running out from the front office. Says, what are you doing here? I said, well, I got hired. He said, well, hired me. I said, I don't know, some great big tall dude. No, here was the plant manager. Anyway, so now I'd go up front, fill the W-4 forms and all that kind of stuff. So I started working at Norplex, and so I said, well, I'm going to work here for 1 year until I figure out what I want to do with my life. Well, there was overtime galore. And so I worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Didn't stop me from stopping at the tavern every night and getting drunk every night. And I played cards, and I gambled, and I love playing cards. When I got off work and I went to go into the tavern, and there was a woman standing there with a baby. Here was a friend of mine. She begged me not to play cards with her husband. I says, well, that guy can't beat me. She says, I know. She says, but we don't have food. I said, what do you mean you don't have food? She says, I don't have money to buy milk for my baby. And I thought, whoa. And it hit me. I didn't care what happened to me, but I didn't want it to affect others around me, And so I tried to give her some money. She said, I don't want your money. She said, I just don't want you to play cards with my husband ever again. And so I went to the tavern. I saw him over there playing cards. And I thought, well, and so I didn't play cards with him. At that time, I was making $3.25 an hour. Working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, I took home $238.72. Every night I spent $100 at the tavern playing cards. I was winning money from other people. I learned how to play cards when I was 4 years old, and I was a really good card player. And but I didn't care what happened to me. Well, a friend of mine, he said, let's go to the races. So we went to walk on. We went to stock car races, and I thought, what a boring thing this is. Cars going round and round and round. Anyway, so we got up down to the races. Well, now you're all juiced up, and so I'm driving 100 mile an hour, and I took the old stage road, and it's a windy, twisty road, and I was going to hit this corner. It's about a 30 mile an hour corner, and I was going 100, and I'm going to hit that corner about 90, and all of a sudden I see a flash of light in the distance. I thought, oh, car's coming, and so I let off the gas, and I was on the wrong side of the road. I started to go on the other side of the road, and just like that, there was a car right at me. And I cranked the wheel to the right and closed my eyes, bracing for impact, and it was nothing. I looked up, and there was a solid rock wall of a hill I was going to run into. And I cranked it to the left, and I was going to go down this embankment about 40 feet down, and there's a creek down there. So I cranked it back again, and now I'm going on the road in circles. And I can't get control of the car. And so I'm trying to get control. I got the back end, but I couldn't get the front end. So I'm going back and forth, back and forth. So was I pleading for my salvation? Was I looking to God? No, I was cursing God. I said, God, I'm going to wreck my brand new car. And looked over, and there was my best friend. Hands on the dash. We didn't wear seatbelts back then. And his whole face was white as a sheet. And I prayed, for the first time in my life, I said, God, don't kill Lynn. And I come around the corner, and there was this place where they used to have a garbage bin where the rural people could drop their garbage off, but it wasn't there anymore. And I saw that, and I just grabbed the steering wheel, and I hit those power brakes with 2 feet, and went zoo, 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 boom. Landed right there. Didn't wreck my car. And I thought, wow, here I am. Now I almost killed my best friend. I don't care what happens to me. I didn't care if I lived or died because I was heartbroken. Anyway, and then it started to bother me. I thought, wow, I don't want to hurt the people I love. And so I decided that I was going to go quit my job and I was going to move to Las Vegas on my 21st birthday. And I went home and Dad says, what are you going to do on your birthday? I said, well, I'm going to quit my job and move to Vegas. He said, what are you going to do in Vegas? I says, I'm going to play cards. He says, you think you make a living playing cards? I says, yeah. They always said, do what you love. You never work a day in your life, and I love to play cards. Yeah, my dad, he was a very ungodly man, but he was wise in this instance. He never told me don't do it. That'd be stupid, because I'd been gone the next day. He told me about all the different things going on in Vegas and all the machines and all the different gambling stuff. And he asked me, he says, do you count cards? And I said, yeah. He says, do you remember the cards? And I said, yeah. So he got out a deck of cards, and we started playing blackjack, and we played like 6 hands. And he says, do you remember the cards are played? And I said, yeah. And so he picks them up. He says, tell me what they were. And so I told him what they were. And we played again for a few more minutes. And we went through the whole deck of cards, and I remembered every card that was played. I can't remember names, but I can remember numbers. And he says, can you do it with 2 decks? And I said, 2 decks? What are you talking about? Well, he got out 2 decks. Well, I failed miserably. He says, in Vegas, there's 6 decks. And so he explained all the reasons. And then I thought, wow, this doesn't sound good. Maybe it's not a good idea. What a brilliant moment, huh? That I decided, well, maybe I shouldn't go to Vegas to play cards. Well, the next thought was, I'm not working in this factory for the next umpteen years. So I thought, well, I'm going to join the service. And so I called the recruiter up. My dad was in the Air Force, and so I called the recruiter up, and I set up an appointment to meet with the Air Force recruiter in Dubuque. And that was going to be a Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. And the night before, I went out with my friends, and I went home about 10:30. I thought, well, I got to get up and go to the recruiter. Well, as soon as I pulled in my driveway, some other friends pulled up, and they said, let's go to Austin. I said, no. I said, I'm not going to. I'm done drinking tonight. I said, I got to go to bed. Oh, come on, it's wedding dance. You're like it. So the next thing you know, I'm in the car going to Austin. So we went to this wedding dance, and this place was just packed. And people everywhere, smoke everywhere. I hated cigarette smell. And so I took my beer, and I walked outside, and I sat down on the curb. Looked at my watch, and I thought, oh man, how am I going to get home? When are these guys going to get done? And next thing you know, I feel this tap on my shoulder. I look up, it's Diana Crane. And she says, you got a minute? And I said, sure. She said, let's go for a ride. So we got in her car, and she started crying. And I said, well, what's the matter? Well, the man she was living with had just beat her up. And I says, well, why don't you leave? And she says, I don't know how to. I says, just get in your stuff and leave. I said, don't you have a friend? And she said, yeah. Well, we went to her trailer, and she called this friend. And, yeah, come on over. So we packed her up, and I moved her and her son out that night. We went to this friend's place. And I told her, I says, I got to be in Dubuque at 9 o'clock, so I got to leave Decorah by 7 at the latest. So I got up, and she says, do you mind if I come with you? And I said, oh, that's fine. And so we drove 2.5 hours to Dubuque. And we had a conversation. And I didn't realize that she had loved me all this time too, and I knew I loved her. And we drove right by the Air Force recruiter, and I decided that I wasn't going to go to service. Well, so now we're together. We moved in together, and now I got something to live for, because now with the woman I'm in love, I'm with her. And she asked me, she says, would you go to a gospel meeting with me? I said, sure. And I said, what's a gospel meeting? She said, that's a place where they open the Bible and they preach from the Word of God and preach the gospel. And I says, so is it like a church? And she says, well, kind of, but they tell you how to be saved. I says, saved? What's saved? And she couldn't explain to me what saved was, even though she'd been raised in a Christian home her whole life. And so I thought, whatever, So we pulled up and we walked in this place, and there's this gospel hall in this building. I thought, never heard of gospel hall. Anyway, so we went in there and sat down and looked around, and there was scripture text all over the walls. I thought, well, that's kind of nice, Anyway, I looked around, there was no organ, and somebody got up and they gave a hymn out, and they started singing without any music. Now, that's different. I thought, well, whatever they want to do, doesn't matter to me. I'm Lutheran. Remember, I've been in Lutheran church in 5 years. And anyway, there was an evangelist that had stopped that night. I'm pretty sure that's why we were invited to meet him that night. He's from Appleton, Iowa, and he was at one of the Wisconsin fall conferences. And so he got up and he preached from John 3, chapter 3. And in there, it talked about if you're ever going to be in the kingdom, you have to be born again. And I had never heard about being born again, even though Jimmy Carter had talked about being born again the year or two before that when he was elected president. But I didn't pay any attention to anything that was going on in the world because I didn't care. Anyway, so I thought, I got to be born again. But all of a sudden I had a peace. And I call it a false peace because I thought, well, there's the answer I've been looking for. I knew the Lutheran way of just doing the best you can wasn't good enough. That wasn't right. But I thought, okay. By the time we left the hall and got into our car, I determined that what I want to worry about being saved for right now, or being born again right now. When I'm 88 years old, then I'll look at that then. I got things to do, places to go. I don't have time for this religious stuff. I don't want nothing to do with religion. And I never thought about being born again. Well, that was October. And then in January of the next year, there was gospel meetings going on in West Union. The same evangelist that was there in October, he come back with a man called John Slabaugh, and they were having gospel meetings. And these meetings went on for 4 weeks before we were ever invited. And to this day, that just befuddles me. I cannot believe that we were not invited to gospel meetings before then. Anyway, Diane says, you want to go to gospel meetings? And I thought, well, if you're going, I'm going to go. So we went, and he preached from Romans 3 in chapter 3. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And the Spirit of God was working me. I didn't realize it. I've become offended. I thought, well, we're all sinners. But I thought everybody was looking at me and pointing the finger at me and saying, you're a sinner, you're a sinner, you're a sinner. But it's really God who was telling me that I was a sinner. And I didn't like that. But I went and listened to everything they had to say. And they talked about Christ dying on the cross and Christ dying for sinners. And I thought, well, I know all that. I knew that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believed in him should not perish. I thought, I'm part of the world. I believe that. What am I missing? Just don't talk about this. Just tell me how to be born again. Just tell me how to be born again. I want to know how to be born again. And so we went the next night, and the same thing. They talked about Christ on the cross, and I'm going, what are you talking about? I don't know about Jesus. Tell me how to be born again. So blinded, I didn't realize it at the time. Anyway, but I listened intently with every word, trying to understand what they were saying. And we had gone to supper the night before, and her dad was preaching at me. And the one talent I do have is I can make people very upset. And I got her, and her dad, he was saved, and he was in the meeting in the West Union. And I got him so mad, he's beating on the table in front of me, and he says, you gotta know. And I'm staring into his eyes, and these caterpillar eyes were staring into his eyes going, wow, this man really thinks he knows. I thought, I never heard of such a thing. How can you know? I thought, this can't be right. But that chart that they had on the wall bothered me. There's the 2 roads, 2 destinies charts. And one road goes up the narrow way, which goes up to heaven. And then they have the broad path, which leads down to death and destruction. But the thing, and I looked at that and I go, oh, yeah, there's no way I'm going to heaven. I don't have a problem with that. But at the same time, I thought, well, I'm not that bad. I'm just like everybody else. Everybody sins. Why are you picking me up? Why are you pointing at me saying, hey, you? And I looked up and I said, not me. There's no way God would put me in hell. I thought, why? Why would God put me in hell? I'm not that bad. Sure, I did this and that and other thing, but if everybody sins, why would God pick me out and say that you're going to go to hell? And I thought, I was 99.9% sure that these people didn't know that they were going to go to heaven. That they didn't know for sure. And I thought, well, who do they think they are? They think they're going to heaven, but they're telling me I'm going to hell. Nobody ever told me I was going to hell. God, through his word, was telling me that my sin was taking me down that broad way which leads to hell. And I thought, how can this be? Anyway, the next night, we were supposed to go to a party of a friend of mine. And I get home from work, and Diana, she's at the sink. And she's washing dishes, and she says, I want to go to the gospel meeting tonight. And I said, we can't. I said, we already promised we're going to go to the Lubies. I said, we got to go to the party. And she says, well, you go to the party. She says, I want to go to the meeting. She says, I don't want to go to hell. Well, I said, I don't either, but I said, I promised. I made a promise. I've never broke a promise in my life. I says, I promised to go to the party. She says, you go to the party. What happens? The phone rings. Anyway, so she's talking on the phone, and she says, my brother wants to talk to you. And he's trying to convince me to go to the gospel meeting. And I explained the same thing to him, that I would. I have no problem going to the gospel meeting. But I says, I already made a commitment. He says, well, better hope the Lord don't come. And he hung up on me. Furious. I grabbed the phone off the wall, and I ripped it off the wall, and I threw it across, hit the wall, and it bings over. And I went in there, and I'm just going off the deep end, and I'm cussing, and I'm chewing. And I said, that brother, I'm gonna pound this guy to smithereens. Anyway, and Diana's not saying nothing. Anyway, I rant and rave for who knows how long, and I sat down, and she says, I want to go to the gospel meeting. And I look over, and she's crying. Yeah. And I says, okay. I said, we're going to the meeting. So, time to go to the meeting. We get in the car, and we go down there, and we have to drive right by the place where I'm going to this party. I looked over there, and I'm just furious. Anyway, so we get to the hall, and we go in there, and I see her brother way up in the front row. And I'm just furious, and I thought, I'm going to just pound that guy. I am just going to pound him. And then they're preaching again, and they're preaching about Christ dying on the cross for sinners. I thought, you guys are like a broken record. Same thing over and over and over. And you quit telling me about Jesus. Tell me about how to be born again. Anyway, But got over, and then they gave out a hymn. And this hymn goes like this. It says, "Say, poor sinner, take salvation. Jesus died to set you free. Do not get the dreadful answer, I'll be saved, but not tonight. Give me just a little longer, for the world looks now so bright. When I feel that I'm dying, I'll be saved, but not tonight." Well, that hit me like a ton of bricks. I was so embarrassed. I thought everybody was looking at me and saying, "Hey, that's you," because it was exactly what I thought. When I'm 88 years old, I worry about this. Not now. And well, the anger went away from me 100%. And her brother comes running up to me and he apologized. He said, "I'm so sorry." And I said, "That's okay, you know." Anyway, so we go home and nobody says a word. We go home. Next day, Saturday, and I go to work. And I'm thinking, why would God put me in hell? I just don't understand. Why would God put me in hell? I thought God loved me. I thought God loved me so I could go to heaven. And I thought, I don't care if I go to heaven, but I don't want to go to hell. And I kept thinking about that chart. I kept thinking, seeing that little thing that says no middle path. And I said, I wish I could just die as a dog and I don't have to worry about this. Anyway, so then I went to work on Sunday again. And all I could think about was, how do I stay out of hell? Even though I didn't think I was going to go to hell. And we went to meeting on Sunday night, and then we went on Monday. And the next day, I think it was Tuesday, I'm walking. I couldn't hardly do my job because all I could think about was trying to figure this out. And one of my friends comes flying up, and he grabs me by the shirt, and he throws me against the lockers, and he says, "Where have you been going tonight?" I says, "What do you mean where have you been going tonight?" He says, "Well, you're not stopping downtown." He says, "To have a beer." He says, "Where are you going tonight?" I said, "I've been going to gospel meetings." He says, "Gospel meetings? What in the cuss are you going to gospel meetings for?" And I shoved him away. I says, "I'm trying to stay out of hell." He just looks at me like, "What?" We went to meeting that night again, and same old thing. Talking about Christ dying on the cross for your sins. And I thought, why don't they just tell me how to be born again? I don't understand. Why don't they tell me? Well, we got to the door, and John Slaybaugh stops us, and she says, "Would you come over to your," he said to Diana, he says, "Would you come over to your grandparents' place?" Well, her grandpa was, he was an elder in the assembly at West Union. And she says, "Oh, yeah." And so I'm sitting there going, I don't want to talk to no preacher. Anyway, so we get there, and we walk up the door, and John shakes my hand, and he says, "What do you got to do to be saved?" And I almost hit him. I thought, if I knew what I had to do to be saved, I'd do it and I'd be saved. And I says, I don't know. I don't know. I says, I must have to study the Bible. I says, I know that answer is right there in the Bible. And so we come in, and he opens the Bible, and we sit down, and we start talking. And he's picking my brain about this and asking me all these different things, and showing me different scriptures. He takes me to John 3:16. I thought, I've heard that verse enough. Show me something else. And so he went to Isaiah 53, 5 and 6, and he read it. And he said, "Do you understand that?" He says, "Yeah." He said, "Well, tell me what it means." And I couldn't tell him what it meant. So he went through it, and we were going back and forth, talking to John back and forth. And every time I had a question, he'd answer me with a verse out of the Bible. And all I was going to think was, this guy knows his Bible. Anyway, so we were going back and forth and back and forth. And then he would talk to Diana, and he'd go back and forth. And sit there. And finally he says, "Well, I think that's enough." He says, "I think you kids ought to go home and think about what you heard." And he pulls out a gospel tract, and he writes on there, John 3:16. Yeah, I'm not going to look at that. Then he writes down Isaiah 53, 5 and 6. I said, we just spent an hour talking about Isaiah 53, 5 and 6. And then he writes down 1 Peter 2 and 24. And I'd like to turn to that verse right now. First Peter 2 and 24. I should have turned to that a long time ago, but they didn't. And the verse says, who, his own self, bare our sins in his own body on the tree, that we being dead to sins should live unto righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. But I didn't read that verse. And but I turned to it and I had my Bible open. And he starts talking again. And well, now I have no questions left. He's talking to me, and I'm just sitting there listening. I don't respond. And so now he quits talking to me. And then he starts talking to Diana. He talks to her for quite a while. And I'm sitting there going, all of a sudden I go, it's hopeless. And he looks at me and he says, you just come that close to salvation. I thought, what? All of a sudden the thought come over me, I really had to go to hell. All this time I thought, there's no way God would put me in hell. Sure, I sinned, but God wouldn't put me in hell. And I almost started crying. I got up and I went into the bathroom, and I thought, I really have to go to hell. I really have to go to hell. And then I got mad. I thought, I wish I'd never stepped foot in that gospel hall. I says, I had no peace before, but at least I didn't know I was going to go to hell. So I washed up a little bit, got a hold of myself, and went back out and I sat down in the chair, and I was sitting there, and all I could think was, I really have to go to hell. And I was devastated. I was just sitting there. And then all of a sudden Diana, she takes the Bible and she says, well, it's right here. It's right here. God says so. I go, God says so. All of a sudden, thought come over in me. You need to be saved. And I looked down, and that's where I read 1 Peter 2 and 24 for the very first time. And I read that, who his own self, and this is how I read it, bear my sins in his own body on the tree. I wasn't thinking about anybody else. All of a sudden, I was thinking about my sins, because I just found out that my sins was taking me to hell. And I read that, who his own self bear my sins in his own body on the tree. And I could just picture, here was Christ, and here was me, and I saw my sins being taken off of me and being put on Christ. And I read farther, who, being dead to sins, should live unto righteousness. I said, my sins are taken off of me, they're put on Christ. I'm dead to sin, I'm going to heaven. Whoa, that can't be. I can't be going to heaven, I'm going to hell. And I read that verse again, who his own self bare my sins in his own body on the tree. And I saw the same thing, sins taken off me, put on Christ. When God looks at me, he sees me with no sin because my sins were all bore for Christ. I thought, I'm going to heaven because of Christ. I didn't know I got saved. I didn't know I was born again. All I knew was my sins were taken off of me and they were put on Christ. And then John says, well, it's midnight. We gotta go to bed. And so they go on, everybody got on their knees to pray. I never been on my knees to pray at all. And Robert Orr, he starts praying that our eyes might be open, that we might see the Christ died for our sins. And I popped up and I want to say, hey, I just saw that. And I thought, what is Diana going to say? She's wanted this her whole life. And I thought, oh boy. And I closed my eyes and I thank God for Christ bearing my sins, his own body in the tree. And then we got up and we got in the car and we sat there. We lived 20 minutes away. We sat there and nobody says a word. And then Dinah looks at me and she says, I got saved tonight. I said, what? She says, I got saved tonight. I says, I think I did too. And she looks at me, she says, "Yeah, I think you did. Either you did or you didn't. Either you know you did or you don't know." She says, "There's no in between." She says, I says, "I don't know." And so we drove to Monona where we lived. And all I could think about was what happened to me. And time I got there, I realized that was salvation. Christ died for my sins on the cross. And we got there, and she says, "I'm not sure." I says, "What do you mean you're not sure?" She says, "I'm not sure all of a sudden." So we got there. I don't even remember going to bed. I remember opening the door and walking up to go to the apartment. And I was, all I know was, I'm going to heaven. She spent all morning searching the scriptures for assurance. And by the time I got up to go to work, she had gotten assurance that she was saved. And I went to work, and I thought, and I was happy, and I thought, I can't believe that Christ bore my sins in his own body and spirit. And I thought, I'm not going to tell anybody. I'm not going to say nothing, you know. So I'm working, and somebody walks by and says, "Huh, not a grouchy old bear today, huh?" I says, What do you mean?" "You've been so early the last 2 days." He said, "I couldn't even stand to look at you, let him talk to you." And she said, now you're doing good." And I thought, huh. I didn't realize it was having an effect on people. About 9 o'clock, I thought, I gotta tell somebody. So I walked up front, and there's a friend of mine that worked up in the front office. And I said, "Hey, Ruth Ann, you got a minute?" And she says, "Sure." And so I sat down, and I told her what happened. Because I thought, this is so simple. How come I didn't see this before? Now, I've been to 6 gospel meetings in my life in this time period. And I thought, I should have seen this a long time ago. Anyway, so I told her, but her response wasn't what I thought. She goes, "Oh, well, that's good." Anyway, I went back out on the floor, and I was so happy after I told her I got saved. And so I worked for a few more minutes. And I walked up to somebody else, and I says, "Can I tell you something?" She says, "Yeah." And so I told her how I got saved. "Really?" Anyway, so I went back to work, and then went over and I saw somebody else, and I told them how I got saved. And I'm sitting there, I'm just rejoiced. I'm so happy. I can't believe it. All of a sudden, one of my classmates that runs up to me, she says, "Did you get saved?" I says, "Yeah." She looks at me in disbelief, and she walks away, she says, "Dan Roffman got saved." I didn't know she was saved. She went to a Baptist church, and she professed to be saved. And she was astounded that a scoundrel like me had gotten saved. And I was so happy, but I thought, how come? I thought they'd tell somebody, and then get saved right away. Anyway, so I went home, and then Diana told me that she got her assurance, and I didn't even know what assurance was. And so we went to meeting that night, and now they're preaching. And I'm going, "Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh this is so good." Before I was sitting there, I hated the gospel. I'm sitting there going, "Oh yeah, this is so good, you know." And they sang "Happy Day" for us, and I thought, I didn't know such a thing, but I love singing that song. And we got up, and one of the older Christian women come up to Diane. And she says, "What did you see?" And I thought, what did you see? And then Diana tells what she saw, how she saw that Christ died for her sins. I'm sitting there going, well, that's what I saw too. Anyway, and that's how God saved me. So I don't know who in here is saved, who knows for sure. If you don't know for sure, you need to go around that foundation. You need to know. You need to know for sure. I never heard such a thing before that. I thought these people were pretty audacious talking about how they know. I thought, you can't know. And anyway, so that's beginning. That was February 25th, 1979. That's when God reached and saved my soul. So, might want to close with a word of prayer. So, anybody have